Welcome to the CIVICA Data Science Seminar Series. I'm really happy to welcome Roman Rivera to the first talk of the series this month. And Roman is the third-year PhD student at Columbia in Department of Economics. His focus is on policing, crime, and labor. Interestingly, before doing his PhD, Roman was a full-time data scientist. So that's a nice match to our data science seminar series. And he worked as a data scientist on the Citizens Police Data Project, which still is a really nice project collecting and publishing information about police misconduct in Chicago. If you look at the Citizens Police Data Project, really nice visuals, really nice data analysis, but also highly consequential societal impact of this project. And I'm sure that's what we will be talking about in one way or another connected today with the talk that Roman is presenting is on police diversity to prevent violence. And this is based, if I'm not mistaken, on your recent paper that was published in Science, the top journal in general science. So without further ado, I will turn over to Roman and we can start there.
Thanks, Professor Jenkin, for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to Civica and for all of you for attending. So yeah, I'm going to be presenting today a paper about diversity in policing that was published in Science, the role of officer, race, and gender in police-civilian interactions in Chicago. It's co-authored with Bo Carba at University of California at Irvine, Dean Knox at Wharton, and Jonathan Mumolo at Princeton. So the motivation here is really a very old question about whether or not racial and gender diversity matter in policing. In the last half a decade, at least in the United States, there have been increasing concerns and allegations over abusive and discriminatory policing. And this has been really focused on the presence of racial biases in police-civilian interactions and street stops, traffic stops, the use of force. But naturally, such issues extend across the world, as we're recently seeing protests about police violence in England, I believe. And so historically, in the US at least, police departments have been comprised nearly all of white males, despite the fact that they police very diverse populations, particularly in large cities. So reformers cast this lack of diversity in policing as a problem and one of the root causes of the existence of abusive and discriminatory policing that they see. And now the oldest potential solution that actually has been proposed since the very inception of modern police departments in the United States is descriptive representation. These first started being proposed during the Jim Crow era and right after the Civil War in the 1800s. So date back quite a while for when this was first proposed. But essentially, it comes down to the idea that hiring and deploying more minority and female officers would improve policing of marginalized groups. But given the fact that this is quite an old question, we're actually asking a very simple one, which is, does it have any promise at all? Do underrepresented minorities, Blacks, Hispanics, and female officers have different policing outcomes when in the same circumstances as their white and male counterparts? So like I said before, this is a very old question. It's very basic when you get down to it, but yet there really isn't a consensus in this in terms of research on policing. And we think that the root cause of the fact that there is no consensus and there's a lot of messy evidence is the fact that there hasn't been officer level data in previous studies. So in economics, at least, the research on diversity in policing extends back to 2001, over 2 decades ago, with Donahue and Levitt. And basically they look at whether or not increasing the amount of Black officers in a police department is going to change who gets arrested, basically. But they have to explicitly make the assumption that Black officers and white officers are assigned randomly, right? And even in a footnote, they say, hey, we know this isn't true, right? This is almost certainly not the case, but we just don't have any data to contradict it, right? And all studies since then have also used largely aggregate data sets that are at the department level. And so you can't see where officers are actually working or when they're working for that matter. So let's say Black officers actually would make fewer arrests than white officers in the same circumstances. But if they're assigned to higher crime areas, that differential behavior is going to be masked, or it might even go into the opposite direction. And so the effects that you're going to find might be the completely wrong sign or a wrong magnitude, etc. A second issue, which also comes into studies that have tried to approximate where and when officers are working with event data, like we know let's say when they make a stop, the beat that they were assigned to, or the time they made a stop. And then with that, we're going to approximate when and where the officer was assigned. Well, in that case, you only see the times officers were working and they made a stop or an arrest or use of force. So you can't see the zeros. And without the zeros in the data, you're going to also get some strange estimates when you try to use these methods, as we're going to show later in the paper. So our design in this paper is going to address both of these issues by using high detailed officer level data. We're going to be using officer daily assignments and their activity on those days, their stops, their arrests, their uses of force. And we're also going to be comparing officers working in similar conditions. So officers working within the same MDSB. What that is the year and month, the shift, the day of the week, and the beat that they're assigned to. A beat is both a geographic area, but it's also a task. So beats ending in 02 signify that the officer is actually on desk duty. Or if they end in 06, it means they're in an 06 car. So it not only dictates kind of where they are, but it also tells you what they're doing while they're working. And then we're going to exploit quasi-random variation in the rotating work schedule that CPD officers, Chicago Police Department officers, have to abide by, which is going to give us a lot of nice variation in terms of who's working where and when. To summarize our findings, right off the bat, we find that minority and female officers are assigned to incredibly different areas on average. And so this kind of partially explains why previous estimates have been kind of all over the place, and you can't really get a good read on what the actual effect of descriptive representation in policing is. In terms of the main results, we find that Black officers behave differently from non-Black officers. So they make fewer stops, they use force less frequently, they make fewer arrests, particularly of Black civilians. Hispanic officers, on the other hand, also have like fewer enforcement events against civilians on average, but the difference is smaller between them and white officers than it is between Black and white officers. And there's also, oddly, or appearingly oddly, there is no evidence that they treat Hispanic civilians any differently than white officers do. But where the difference actually does come in is that they exhibit less contact and less enforcement against Black civilians. And lastly, with female officers, they actually make very similar number of stops as male officers, pretty much the exact same. They make slightly fewer arrests, but the big difference comes in at use of force. So female officers, the gap between how much force they use relative to male officers is similar to the gap between Black and white officers. So quite substantial. So in terms of the outline of the rest of this talk, first I'm going to go through some important institutional background, some data and descriptives, then getting into the results. I'm first going to do the main results by the type of interaction, the civilian race, the type, etc. And then we're going to break down the results by the composition of the districts that the officers are actually working in, and I'm going to conclude with takeaways. Okay, so there are two very important things you need to know here. Is about district and shift assignments. So basically, Chicago as a city has 22 police districts, and you can think of these kind of as neighborhoods. And I'm sure that around the world they have different names for them. In New York, they call them precincts. So even within the U.S., we have different names for them, but they're kind of like neighborhoods. And so officers assigned to a specific district are going to be in that district on a day-to-day basis. They're not going to move very frequently at all between districts in terms of where they're working. Secondly, and this is very important, which is why it's bolded, there is a rotating operations calendar that officers have to abide by. So it determines the days that the officers are working and the days that they're off. Now, this calendar is determined a year in advance, and which group you're in, i.e. who you're going to be on with and who you're going to be off with, is determined a year in advance as well. Okay. So on a day-to-day basis, officers have virtually no control over whether or not they're working on that day. and they have little control over their assignment on that day. Okay, so now getting into the data, the two sources for this data for this project are the Chicago Police Department, the CPD, and Chicago's Department of Human Resources, DHR. And between these two agencies, we have officer demographic information, age, race, gender, tenure on the force, etc., as well as their assignment data. So their daily assignments, the beat they're assigned to, the watch they're assigned to, how long they work that day, etc. And that's about 3 million observations in the final sample that we use. And then we have the enforcement data, which is the stops, their arrests, their uses of force, which is about 1.5 million events over the course of the same period. Now, what's also interesting about this project is that it didn't come from collaboration with the city of Chicago or the CPD itself or with any governmental agency. This data was actually collected through years of public records requests, about 5 years, and collaboration with other researchers, journalistic organizations, advocate groups. So really quite a broad effort to bring all this data together that didn't require any actual collaboration with the police department itself. It's been entirely independent. In terms of the sample selection that we're going to use, we're going to be focusing on the years from 2012 to 2015, mainly due to the fact that stop and assignment data overlap in that period. We're also going to be restricting to Black, Hispanic, and white officers as they compose 97% of the force. Second to last, we're going to be looking at D1 officers that are assigned to geographic units. Basically, that means the unit that the officer is assigned to corresponds perfectly to one of the districts that I talked about before. And D1 basically means you're not a detective, you're not a sergeant, you're just a regular police officer. These are the people who you kind of think about when you think of a police officer. They make street stops, they answer 911 calls, etc. Now, we're also going to be looking at the standard shifts, which are the morning shift, the day shift, and the night shift. Okay, so this is the very oddly shaped city of Chicago. So you can see that it's both a diverse city and a segregated one. So according to the 2010 census, it's about 30% Black, white, and Hispanic, with majority Black districts being generally on the south side and 2 on the west side, and then majority Hispanic districts being mostly on the west side. The north side and the downtown area, which is right here, are majority white and a little bit of no majority in the middle. Okay, and so correlated with race very heavily is crime rates and levels of poverty, which is important to keep in mind. So to get a detailed view of the data, we're going to zoom into this district right here, which is District 2. If any of you have visited the University of Chicago and know where it is, it's actually right here. So as you can see by the shading of the map, the area of the University of Chicago is shaded much more white than the rest of District 2, which, as you'll recall from the previous map, is majority Black. So actually the population is more than 90% Black, according to the 2010 census. And what you can see here is that as you move away from campus, the shading becomes darker. That means that the population is higher share Black as you move away from campus, but also you can see many more dots on the map as you move away from campus, so away from the less Black area. And the green dots indicate an individual stop, so we know the exact location of these stops. The blue squares, which are a little bit harder to see, are arrests, which again, we know the exact time and location of those, and the X's are uses of force. And so looking over at the left side of the panel, we can see also for 4 officers over the course of the same time period, we know exactly what beat they're assigned to. So for example, on this day, Officer D was assigned to beat 206C, right? Which is slightly different than 206B and 206A, okay? And we know that they were working that day because of the assignment records, but we also know the stops, the arrests, and the use of forces they made over the course of their time of the force, meaning that we can overlap that with the assignment data. So we know the days that they were working and they didn't make an arrest, and we know that they were working and they did make an arrest and at what point in their shift they did. Okay, and that applies for stops, arrests, and uses of force. So pulling back a little bit, who works where? So are officers in any way assigned differently based on their race? Well, yes. Black officers, as you can see by the 2 red dots, are assigned to higher crime districts on average than Hispanic and white officers, with more police officers per capita and a higher proportion of co-racial residents, so basically more Black residents. Notably, that conditional on race, you don't see very much difference in terms of where officers are assigned between male and female officers. Now, in terms of when, this also matters quite a bit. As anybody who's been to or lived in a major metropolitan area knows, the composition of the people that are around, walking on the street, living lives and whatever, in an area in a city can drastically change between one time of day versus one time of night. And therefore, the civilians that the officers are observing, that they have the potential to interact with, will also change based on the time of day. So what you can see here is that Black officers and female officers are much more likely to work the day shift compared to Hispanic, white, and male officers that are more likely to work the night shift. Okay, so now getting to kind of the wonky comparisons that you can make, or the wonky results you could find if you just did like raw comparisons for like, without taking into account where or when the officers are working. I want you to look at this lovely highlighting I did in Adobe. This is for the amount of stops, arrests, and uses of force against Hispanic civilians by officer racial group. And what you would conclude if you just did a raw comparison for this is that Hispanic officers use more force, they make more arrests of, and they stop Hispanic civilians at higher rates, much higher rates than their Black and white counterparts. And so you might come away with some strange conclusions if you just did this sort of aggregate level comparison and not controlling for where or when these officers are working. To dig into that a little bit deeper, what we do is we kind of put some blinders on and pretend that we had worse data than we do to see how our estimates would change if we replicated like previous analyses using our finer grain data. So right here, we have the correct estimate in terms of the gap between Black and white officers that we find when we control for the beat, the shift, the day of the week, the month, and the year, right? We get an estimate of about -2. And then what we can do here is we drop the zeros. So that means we only observe an officer shift if they made an arrest on that day, okay? And when you do the Black-white comparison there, you get a noisy estimate, but it's positive, right? So this is like kind of the event level study where like, we're approximating where and when officers are working by only if they can report an arrest that day, and we don't see the shift otherwise, okay? So this is dropping the zeros. Now, what happens if we pull back further and say, well, we also drop the zeros, but we can only see officers in terms of their district and the month they're working in, the year month they're working in? Well, in that case, you get a negative and noisy effect. So if you had this sort of data and you drop the zeros, you could come to a conclusion in either direction. And you might come to the conclusion that actually descriptive representation shouldn't matter at all because Black and white officers basically make the same number of arrests per shift. And lastly, there's the estimate if you drop the zeros, but you do an unrestricted analysis of officers in total. So basically just doing average arrests per shift between officers of two groups. In terms of Black and white officers, you get a very large, twice the size of our correct estimate, negative estimate. So this really illustrates how with different approaches to the study and with deficient data, you can come to all sorts of conclusions, and kind of explains why in previous studies, you can probably find a result any which way you want in terms of whether or not there's a difference between Black officers and white officers when it comes to policing. Okay, so in terms of our empirical strategy, like I said before, we're going to be comparing officers working in similar conditions. So that's within officers within the same MDSB. So that's the year and month crossed with the day of the week, crossed with the shift, crossed with the beat. So this is essentially just comparing officers working within beat 1, 2, 3, 4 in shift 2 in January of 2012 across all the Tuesdays, okay? And because of the calendar that officers have to abide by, they have no choice over whether or not they're working on a specific day. But also it means that because of how the groups rotate, that the composition of officers that's working in this MDSB on the first Tuesday in the month is going to be different than the second, different than the third, different than the fourth Tuesday, okay? And so we're going to use this to identify what we think is a very policy relevant parameter, and we're going to call that the deployment effect. Essentially, it's the experiment of if you're like a district commander or you're a sergeant, you're trying to decide who to deploy into the field. What is the causal effect of deploying a Black officer versus a white officer, or a female officer versus a male officer? And the way we're going to identify that is by doing a within MDSB analysis. So essentially, we're going to look within an MDSB, and we're going to take the average difference in outcomes between groups R and R prime, take the average of the two, and then take the difference, and then sum over that difference across all the MDSBs, and weighting by the frequency of the MDSB. And the results that we find here, which we estimate with like just a simple fixed effect regression, are going to be consistent if we control for things like tenure, or if we do an unweighted summation where all of the MDSBs are weighted the same regardless of their size. So in terms of the results, here's the -2 for the Black-white gap in terms of arrests per 100 shifts that was shown 2 slides ago. So you can see that Black officers make significantly fewer stops, about 15 fewer than white officers over the course of 100 shifts, 2 fewer arrests, and use force about 0.1 fewer times over the course of 100 shifts. These numbers obviously need to be put into scale, so they're each about a 20 to 30% decline relative to average white officer volume citywide, so quite substantial. Keeping the size of those estimates in mind, it's important to then look at the Hispanic and white officers. So Hispanic officers also make fewer stops, use force less frequently, and make fewer arrests per 100 shifts than white officers. However, the differences are smaller. Female officers, as I said at the beginning, are going to make the same number of stops per 100 shifts as male officers. They're going to make slightly fewer arrests. Where the big difference comes in is in the use of force. So they use force about 0.1 fewer times per 100 shifts, which this is about I think a 30% decline relative to white officer volume. So this is quite substantial decline relative to male officer volume as well. Now breaking it down by enforcement type. So we get the expected results for Black officers and Black civilians. And what I mean by that is that the hypothesis for a lot of people advocating for descriptive representation is the idea that, well, if we hire more Black officers and they interact with Black civilians, because Black officers are going to be less biased against Black civilians, you're going to see less enforcement against them. And we find that to be the case with Black officers and Black civilians. So the big difference between white and Black officers is really driven by their less engagement with Black civilians, right? But what's interesting is that for all groups that we find differences, the effects are also just driven by less engagement of Black civilians. So Hispanic officers, their gap is actually also, in terms of stops, arrests, and uses of force, are also driven by less engagement with Black civilians. And for female officers, the difference in their use of force is largely driven by less engagement with Black civilians as well. Interestingly, we don't find the same pattern with Hispanic civilians. So while Black officers make fewer stops, fewer arrests, fewer uses of force against Hispanic civilians, Hispanic officers, actually, we see no significant difference between them and white officers in terms of how they engage with Hispanic civilians, which is fairly interesting. Now, you might be curious about the heterogeneous effects across the different districts that we're looking at, right? Is the effect entirely driven by officer behavioral differences in Black majority districts or not? Well, we find that while the large effect for stops is between Black and white officers is in Black majority districts, that we actually find substantial effects in white majority districts as well, in terms of the Black-white gap, and in terms of the Hispanic-white gap in terms of the use of force. We don't really find very large differences in terms of no majority districts, and we find some substantial difference for Black and white officers in Hispanic majority districts. Okay. So to conclude, basically, and I think this is most relevant for this audience who cares a lot about data science, is that massive administrative data sets exist in order to answer very large questions about public policy, and particularly about policing, which is what I care most about. But in order to do that, we need increased data transparency. For example, we need a lot more data transparency in the US so that studies like this don't take 5 years to collect the data and you don't have to go through appeals processes and lawsuits, et cetera, in order just to get this information. And we would like to replicate this, in the 10,000 police departments across the US to get a better understanding of how diversity influences policing across the nation. Secondly, is that data scientists can exploit institutional details to their advantage, like we did with the operations calendar, but we have to take into account the institutional details in order to make actually like policy relevant and useful empirical results. That if we ignore things like operations calendars or the fact that officers aren't randomly assigned to areas, that we can come to some wonky conclusions that may not match up to reality at all. Secondly, we find that descriptive representation has its biggest impacts on Black civilians. So across the board for Hispanic, female, and Black officers, we find that their representation matters the most in terms of less engagement against Black civilians, even in non-Black majority districts. But the results for Hispanics are mixed. And I think this speaks to the fact that demographic groups aren't monoliths, and probably is relevant for any nation that has an increasing minority population that's largely immigrants. So Hispanics in the US, the population share has grown significantly in the last 20 years. They've come to represent, be the largest minority in the Chicago Police Department fairly recently, replacing Black officers. But it may be that the Hispanics that join the CPD to become police officers are very different than the Hispanics that they're policing. And this comes from the fact that Hispanics are, again, not a monolith. They come from different nations, different languages. They are different, generations of immigrants. So this is something that everybody should keep in mind when studying demographic groups. And lastly, we need to know how officer race and gender influences social outcomes, not just policing outcomes. So are the people that are being arrested, are they actually having guilty verdicts found against them, or are these cases being thrown away? And does diversity matter for that? Because Black officers make fewer arrests, does that influence local crime? And how do communities feel about that? In what direction does it influence local crime? Are people more or less likely to cooperate with police if the police are making fewer stops on a daily basis? Lastly, does descriptive representation matter for police misconduct? Is having more female officers or Black officers working in an area going to decrease the amount of police misconduct? And again, how do civilians and the community feel about that? Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you, Roman. We have immediately one question, so I may as well read it out to you. Olga Gasparian from the Data Science Lab asks, how do you know if the calendar is really as if random, this which you're relying on? And also, can you say something about officers working in teams, and like how does that work in the records?
Right. Okay, I'll answer the first one first. So it's not so much that the calendar is randomly assigned, it's that officers bid for their day off group a year in advance, and that process is also filtered through a seniority bidding order, as well as furlough days. So it gets incredibly complicated. And unless we believe that people are, police officers actually are, like big-brained AIs, it's really unlikely that any officer would be able to look forward onto a specific Tuesday and say, I really want to work this Tuesday. We actually spoke to a Chicago police officer after this, and he mentioned how brilliant it was to compare this because of how chaotic the rotating calendars make who you're going to work with, and that he actually didn't know on a day-to-day basis who he was going to be working with because of how much variation there was in terms of the calendar, adding in furlough days, like what group you're actually in. But yes, so we also do like balance tests and stuff. We're not super concerned about that. We think this is a really good institutional detail. to exploit, and that other police departments actually use as well. So that's something to keep in mind, is that other police departments do operations calendars as well. In terms of, sorry, what was the second question? Sorry about that.
That there are
working
in pairs.
Right.
Yep.
Right. So so a stop in our data can be double counted because usually 2 officers sign off on the stop as primary and secondary. And so what we do as a robustness check is we just take the first officer signing up for that stop, and that doesn't influence the results at all. The magnitudes are smaller because half as many, or roughly half as many stops are being recorded then, but it doesn't influence the results significantly. But as for peer effects in policing, that's definitely something that should be studied in the future and a pathway for future work, but we don't tackle that in this paper.
Okay, great, thank you. So in the absence of a next question, I'm going to abuse my position here and ask you one. I want to press you on the difference between the thing that you estimate and the policy that you're interested in here. So you will not be surprised to know that I'm quite happy about the identification strategy of asking about a single deployment decision to put a white rather than a black officer in place, rather than thinking about race switching weirdness, which is hard to think about. So I think that gets at an effect. But what we're, I guess, interested in from a policy perspective is, should you diversify your police force like as a larger strategy? And it seems like that those two need to be connected, right? Because when you swap a black and a white police officer in a deployment decision, then you're taking, as it were, the whole bundle of characteristics that come with black police officers in your town right now. And so if you're asking, should I add quotas or double the number of outreach efforts to try and hire more black policemen, you're getting compositional. There's like compositional effects for this. So I'm wondering, can you say something about how to connect these individual causal effects to some picture about how you would expect what you would expect the consequences for a larger, like Chicago-wide drive, which I guess they had in the past.
Yeah. Interestingly, academy. So basically, the way you enter into the police academy is based on a lottery by whether or not you get a sufficient score on the entrance exam. And so that actually was introduced in 1991 or 1990, I believe, as a way to increase departmental diversity, and people were very upset about it at the time. And so Chicago, at least in particular, is an oversubscribed city. So I think in the 2010 test that they gave out, 10,000 people took it, 7,000 passed. They had like less than 3,000 people actually become police officers because it's so oversubscribed. So in terms of, is the marginal officer entering equal to the average officer, given the oversubscription rate and the fact that so many more people are passing than are able to be let in before the next test is released, I would probably say in Chicago that you're pretty close to the marginal being equal to the average. In terms of other cities, though, this is definitely not the case. Cities like New Orleans, I believe, are undersubscribed. And so they will just take people as they come and they pass the test and the psychological exams, et cetera. But so in many major cities where it is an oversubscription problem, I think this is an effective comparison. But there is research about the recruitment of police officers. And I think that's very important going forward, not to mention the fact that demographics in terms of who wants to become a police officer is also shifting in the country. And so studies like this should definitely be reproduced at later dates, particularly with the increasing composition of police departments being more and more Hispanic and Black recruitment kind of falling off. So I'm not sure if I perfectly answered your question, but I think it has a lot to think about in it.
So Olga asks the two-finger question on this. I think the question is how easily do you think this study would generalize? Is that fair, Olga? to other places, I guess it would. You're saying your generalization would depend on this oversubscription thing, and you would be certain in proportion to that. Or?
Yeah. So I think our results speak to one city at a specific place and time, and this maybe, I mean, the idea of would hiring Black officers decrease disparities in a city that's like almost all white, it really isn't applicable, right? So in terms of external validity to all other cities in the country, it's limited. But Chicago, I think it's 1 out of every 200 people in the U.S. lives in Chicago. So it's a significant portion of the U.S. population, and it is a city where previous reforms have been tried to diversify police departments and to reform the police department itself. So I think it does have some external validity in that case, but to a broader point, the paper and the methods that we use are very simple, right? The specification and the parameter that we're looking at is very simple to do and doesn't require any fancy econometrics. And in terms of this study itself, the data can be collected in so many other places in order to figure out how much external validity it actually has at different locations and time. And I think that's one of the benefits of the study, is that it really does provide a roadmap for other researchers in order to say, okay, we need assignment data, we need to know the daily shifts or maybe their payroll data. And then from that, we can understand this quantity as long as they use an operations calendar, which, as far as I understand it, is fairly common across police departments in the U.S.
Great, thanks. I in fact I think I mischaracterized Olga's question. So that's my fault. She's asking basically, if you can't get in Chicago, can you then move to New Orleans or some nearby town and become a police officer anyway, if that's your thing? So this is basically like spillover compositional effect type question.
Yeah, so I know that people definitely do move around for police officer jobs, as they are generally pretty high paying and they come with a decent amount of protections, and there's a union, which isn't super common in the US anymore. So yeah, there are definitely spillovers in terms of people that might not get it in Chicago, might move to a different location to do so. I don't think there's any studies about something like that. That would be absolutely fascinating to look at. I've tried pretty hard to get data on the tests that they even give out to police officers, right, in order to figure out if they can get into the academy or not, and they refuse to give them. So I absolutely think that's an excellent direction for future research. We know that there is an issue for officers who are fired or kind of not disbarred, but they're found to be guilty of some sort of misconduct and are therefore terminated, that they kind of go onto this list, and then other police departments can hire them, which is a significant problem and something that's going to be reformed in the future. But so in terms of that end, there's definitely ways of tracking where officers are moving across the country, but that requires that they actually become police officers in the first place.
Right. I guess that speaks to the anecdotal concern that, for example, the University of Chicago's own police force is in some sense the slightly more sketchy end of the larger city's police force, which I wasn't aware was anything more than anecdotal, but it seems it is.
I think they actually have I think they have an educational requirement at University of Chicago Police Department, but I'm not sure. Fortunately, they're a private organization, so I don't think I can FOIA them, but I wish I could. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, Olga is actually curious whether there is any way to track their careers.
For UCPD officers or police officers in general? Oh, for UCPD officers, I really don't know. I've never tried it, but for other police officers, you definitely can. There's a database that you can see, where officers were fired from and where they got rehired at. So it's also interesting.
So Since our audience is quiet, I will monopolize still. I guess so. My understanding is that increasingly American police officers are taken from the ranks of the military, having had significant experience there first, which I think would be a change. Is that sudden enough to make use of variation in?
Yeah, it actually is. In Chicago, at least, we see a massive uptick. Like this is off the top of my head, but I think it goes from something like 15% officers that had prior military experience till something like 80% in terms of new recruits, right? As the McCrary paper that I looked at in like the first two slides shows, like the composition of actual police forces changes very slowly over time because people don't really retire. You kind of stay until you're like 55 or something. And so the actual composition of the CPD changing as a whole is going to be very slow. But in terms of the recruiting classes, yes, there is a very big jump. I can't recall what set of years it is. I think it's in the late or the early 2010s in terms of the share of officers that have military experience. Based on my understanding, that can have beneficial effects in terms of police officers feeling safer on the job, because officers that have been in the military have been in higher stress situations and have more stress training. And so be feeling calm in crowds of people, that can be an advantage. Obviously, there are also disadvantages that can come with that. And I don't know if there are many studies looking at this yet, but it's definitely fruit for future work, given the surge in police departments recruiting people from the military.
Thank you. I should pause here and give a reminder to our online participants that if you do have a burning question, then you should drop it in the Q&A, and I'll read it out. And otherwise, I think I won't see it. Okay. But in the I got what. So I'd like to point out actually to the to people watching here that one of the nice things about this paper is that there is a link at the end, which is to the replication materials, which are running on some kind of live server. So you can in fact run these analyses. Consequently, I did. And one of the things that was, I guess, more striking when the graphs came out was. So I'll put this as a compositional question. If the force was mostly white for a very long time, and then slowly, I guess in the 70s or 80s, 90s, diversification happened, I guess, as a policy decision. Then does this mean then that if a black and a white officer are going out on patrol, then it's likely that the white officer is older than the black one?
Nowadays, no. Black officers are actually on average slightly older than white officers and Hispanic officers. But an interesting feature of the CPD is the fact that everything is so seniority based because it's through a union. So basically what happens is officers, when they're first hired, they have to work in the districts that have the most openings and have the most demand. Those are the districts where nobody wants to work, which is high crime areas, right? So because of that, you get this sorting effect that the officers working in the highest crime areas are often the least experienced and the youngest. And once somebody hits like 5 years, 7 years of tenure, they are bidding as fast as they can to go to a more a lower crime district, basically, and moving out of that area. So it's actually likely that based on that sorting, that you're not going to get that sort of variation. We also have a specification where we control for tenure of the officer, and it doesn't change results at all. But thinking about the experience of people on the force is definitely important, and the fact that actually black recruitment has really dropped off. So in between like 2014 and 2016, the classes are like 50% white, 30 to 35% Hispanic, and maybe like 13% Black, and then the rest Asian, Native American. And so Black officers are actually on average older because white recruitment has maintained at about 50%. Yeah.
Okay. To return just briefly to the implementation of policy, if the union's not going away anytime, then that seniority arrangement's not going away anytime. So I guess you would, if you were going to take a town and say this is the consequence of you increasing diversity in your force, then you would expect you'd have to fold in those choices. You would get an awful lot of new Black officers who would get deployed to places that nobody wanted to be, right. And that would be in some sense part of the part of the. But
that is. Yeah, that's related to the Black majority districting, because race is so heavily correlated with crime and poverty in Chicago, at least. That yeah, so we do have new Black officers. They're about 13%, which is not unsubstantial. And I'm not sure about the more recent cohorts, the ones from like 2018 to 2020. But I've gotten the idea that they are increasingly Hispanic. So I think that the results for the Hispanic officers are very important, and Hispanic officers also display less enforcement against Black civilians than white officers, despite not displaying any difference with respect to Hispanic civilians. But yes, considering the facts of the union and making changes that they are okay with is very important for a lot of police departments, because the unions are so strong and such a heavy part of the police departments themselves. There are a few police departments that don't have a union, but I don't believe that that's a majority of the large ones in the US.
Right. So Olga asks about female versus male sorting, and she was wondering because she assumed that that older policemen were more likely to be male.
No, actually, they're actually more likely to be female. But conditional on, but once you condition on like on race, the gap isn't big. It's like usually like 1 year. But conditional on race also, there is no difference in terms of the district that the officers are placed in based on their gender, which is important. But yeah, there might be some sorting effects, but really however we break it down, as you saw with the different composition of the districts and whatnot, the effects are fairly robust across specifications and whatnot, and controlling for tenure and all that, which is largely collinear with age, as most officers join between the ages of between like 28 to 30, and that's pretty consistent across groups.
Right. So let me just press a little on a more straightforward econometric sort of question. So is it the case that when these folk are doing they're walking their beat, that they are seldom taken out of it, as it were, into the next one along? There's no foot chase that goes into the next region habitually in a way that would mess up your fixed effects there.
Foot chases are pretty rare. Most assignments are actually car assignments, including the ones inside of the districts themselves. It's usually that you're responding to 911 calls within your district itself. But in terms of where officers are assigned and then where their arrests, use of force, et cetera, happen, it is usually pretty concentrated in the area that they are, supposed to be working in. Although they do have, this is why controlling for beat at like a really fine grain level is important, because you can have people that are assigned to a specific beat, and then you can have people assigned to the same beat, but they're just there to like make street stops, and they don't respond to 911 calls. So like the difference between like beat 1, 2, 3, 4 and 1, 2, 3, 4A actually it does matter in terms of the task that they're there to perform, which is why this is such a fine-grained analysis, and that that the 1, 2, 3, 4 might be responding to 911 calls and 1, 2, 3, 4A might not be, but that stays consistent based on the beat code.
Thank you, Slava. Thank you, everybody, and especially Roman for such a fascinating talk. I look forward to our next seminar, which is in 2 weeks' time. No, sorry, in 1 week time, on the 24th of March, so next Wednesday, and we'll be talking about tracking COVID-19 with the Financial Times. So John Byrne Murdoch, who, if any of you are on Twitter, you may well follow him already, because he's been putting out some fantastic visual graphs and pictures showing the progress of the pandemic and the progress of vaccination and all sorts of things that you might not have thought of. So I think it'll be a really interesting data science seminar. So I look forward to seeing you there. And the following one, if you're interested in that, will be on fairness in the labour market, coming up on 7th of April. So just to remind you that you can see all of the upcoming seminars and the schedule on our website, socialdatascience.network.